John Madden is here, a native of England. He is the director of films famous for mixing history and fantasy. Last year he was nominated for an Academy Award for Mrs. Brown, his acclaimed 19th century romance about Queen Victoria. This year he's repeated that success with another period film, Shakespeare in Love. It is a romantic comedy about the world's most revered playwright William Shakespeare and the creation of the greatest love story ever told, Romeo and Juliet. It has received 13 Oscar nominations, including Best Director. Here is a trailer for the film.
Shakespeare in Love.
Romeo and Juliet. Just a suggestion. Good title.
I am pleased to have the director of this film to talk about Shakespeare in Love. And the screenplay, as you may remember, was written by Mark Norman and Tom Stoppard, who was on our program. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Congratulations. More Oscar nominations than any other film. That says something for you, for the film, and for Harvey Weinstein.
Most importantly.
Did you have to convince people that this was a story worth
Yeah, the actors
movie?
Just turned it down all over the place.
Did they really?
No.
I didn't think so.
No, I mean, it was a, I'd never read a script where its kind of appeal and its virtues were so immediately graspable. I mean, it was irresistible from page one to me, the movie. Jeffrey Rush has this thing that he said when he got the script, it had the words "eat me" written on the cover.
Devour me.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It was really kind of something you could taste almost. Very, very unusual.
Now, what was it? I mean, I know what was it that made it like that?
Well, it's very, famously, if you're for a successful movie, you're supposed to be able to sum it up in one line. The one-line pitch is always the thing that you're supposed to be able to do to describe a film. This film completely defies that rule. I mean, I could never really describe, even now, and I've been with the project a long time, describe its appeal in anything other than a list. It was incredibly funny, incredibly fresh. Modern, although set in a time 400 years away from our own, very romantic, very sexy, incredibly surprising, unbelievably original, intelligent, telling several different stories at once. It had no obvious antecedent at all to me. It had films that it related to and that it reminded me of. But
now, there is this story, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, that at one point it was a movie for Julia Roberts. Mm-hmm. And Daniel Day-Lewis?
Yeah. It was originally commissioned. Mark Norman had the idea suggested to him by his son. I'm sure Thomas had told you this on the program. And Mark Norman went to Universal, and to Ed Zwick in particular, and suggested the story. And it was commissioned. And Julia Roberts, somewhere in that process, became attached to it. And it never got made. Tom actually came in and worked on that script at that time. But it never got made, I think, really because they couldn't cast Will. They couldn't find somebody to play Will.
Will as in Will Shakespeare.
Exactly. He's become Will to me, I'm afraid. First name terms only. But it collapsed because of that, but it collapsed quite late in the day. They'd spent a fair amount of money on it. I think she was paid, and therefore it had a price tag on it when it fell apart, and half the...
So money had already been spent when it fell apart.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that was an inhibiting factor in its revival, because we're talking about 1992, and it lay dormant for some time, I'm glad to say, till I came along and woke it up.
So, and you got to do it because everybody was so, including, and especially Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
He was so enamored of Mrs. Brown.
Yeah, yes, I think that is fair to say. That's exactly what it was. I mean, presumably between then and now, there were all kinds of directors under whose gaze it passed, but, luckily for me, they decided not to do it. And I think I just happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment.
So now they say that you're the guy who likes to make films about dead queens.
Exactly.
The sex life of dead queens.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I know. It's weird, actually. There are so many affinities with Mrs. Brown, though, it seems on the surface of it to be a completely different film, a completely different kind of film. But there are bizarre parallels there, actually.
Which are?
Well, they're both stories about impossible love affairs in which an outsider comes into a situation and turns the social order upside down. There's a kind of longing, an unrealizable passion at the centre. I mean, I suppose realized in the later film. They're both deconstruction of icons, I suppose, in little pockets of their lives about which we know very little. But beyond that,
it's almost a humanizing of them. I mean, you see a person coming out of somebody who's a historical figure.
Yeah, that was very much what we wanted to do. I mean, Shakespeare for most people barely exists from the bust down. It's just that kind of rather forbidding image on the frontispiece of all those textbooks. And we think of him really as an old man kind of pouring out masterpieces. And it's incredibly refreshing and liberating to imagine him as what he must once have been, which is a guy with a knack, a guy who's good with the words, struggling to make a living in a very, very competitive environment, in a media which was essentially regarded as verminous, by high society and so forth.
There was some objection to the title.
Yes, it was discussed a great deal amongst us. I have to say I was absolutely adamant that the title should remain what it was. I mean, the S word was something that sent chills down people's spines, and I was led to believe that everybody would run in the opposite direction across the shopping mall if
they were wrong.
I felt that it was my responsibility to make the movie one that earned the right to that title, if you follow me. In other words, if Shakespeare is something that intimidates and frightens and scares people off, then it would be my responsibility to make sure that that wasn't the case in the future. So I felt the movie could be very accessible, could be cinematic and all the things that I think it ought to be, instead of academic and forbidding and remote. And I thought if I could make a movie that actually showed people who Shakespeare was, and i.e. a popular entertainer, somebody who wrote for a mass audience, and elevated that kind of calling to something higher, then I would be doing him a service.
Well, that's what I want to get at. What's the story that you wanted to tell, and what's the story that you think is so enchanting audiences?
Well, probably first and foremost, one must say it is a love story. It's a love story about the greatest love story ever written, or at least the one that is most kind of firmly rooted in the public consciousness.
The love story about Romeo and the creation of Romeo and Juliet.
Indeed, and I think that is at the core of it. Beyond that, it is an affair movie. It's in that tradition, Casablanca and Brief Encounter, the kind of impossible love that can never be. It takes place in a very magical realm, which is a sort of backstage romance, a place where fact and fiction elide into one another. But to me, it was also an opportunity to make something about the power of storytelling, the transforming power of art, the extraordinary power of a collective experience, which is something that, although we see movies collectively, we don't experience them collectively. We experience them individually in the company of other people. With this movie, I think, there is a chance for people to actually see, my God, look, everybody else is reacting the way I'm reacting. This is what happens in the theatre, and what is essential and unique to the theatre. I've tried to transfer it to the screen. I don't know if I've been successful, but that's one of the things...
I think you can rest assured.
That's one of the things that I was trying to do. Yes.
Why was this considered such a difficult job by you? What was so hard about making this movie?
It was very hard to make.
You got Gwyneth Paltrow.
I know, it should be a shoe-in, really, shouldn't it? Oh, okay. They did everything.
You got Joe Fiennes. You've got... on and on.
Judi Dench.
What's so hard for a director
Tom
here?
Stoppard.
Exactly.
All these
you got Stoppard gives you the script, and you got all those actors. I mean, do we need a good director here? Does it just take place on its own?
Evidently not. Evidently not. I think that it was, it was kind of juggling and walking a high wire at the same time. Is what it felt like to me. It felt, the world of the movie is very heightened. It's also telling a story on many different levels at once. It's also following a number of, a sort of vast panoply of characters through the story. But it has a very particular tone to it, and it's a tone in which you know, comedy and intense emotion collide with one another quite frequently. Comedy is not particularly easy to direct on film because you don't have the essential feedback of an audience reaction. You don't have the previews to kind of work it and get it right. Well, you do have those, actually, but you don't have them when you're shooting it. And, of course, you know, once you shot a joke, even a Tom Stoppard joke, a few times, it's not as funny as it was the first time. It was just a tricky film to target. It felt to me, the analogy that I always thought of was like trying to pour liquid into a bottle which had a very, very narrow aperture. And if you didn't aim it properly and you didn't pour it at exactly the right rate, the liquid would spray and spill out over the bottle.
Was there a
and if you did, it filled up perfectly. But it was hard to keep your eye on that target all the time.
Did you know you had it once you started filming, or did you know you had it once you started editing, or did you know? Well,
interestingly, the latter. There were certain points in the movie, in the process of making the movie, where I felt very strong and confident about it. Certainly when I first read the script, even though it developed quite a bit from there. Certainly when we'd finished the shooting script. Certainly when I finished my first cut. Normally when you're shooting...
At the end of your first cut, you knew, no?
I thought, well, it'll work, but I mean, you know, in other words, we've got away with it. It seems to hang together. The story is told. But in all honesty, you don't see over the top of the mountain when you're making a film. You just don't. Your main concern is, will anybody believe it? Will they buy it? I did, and I'm so used to the feeling of making a movie which I kind of think is good, and maybe if I'm luckier, you know, tiny little coterie of terribly intelligent people will think is good as well. But you know, usually you find that actually, I've found it's a smaller number than a larger number. And I, you know, obviously felt very passionate about the film. I did not know whether a very large audience would. I suppose there were times when I thought and hoped it would and believed that it had a wide audience. But I wouldn't have known that. But, you know, normally when you make a movie, for example, you know, the scene between Billy Connolly and Judi Dench where she first meets him, when that scene plays, you can feel in the rushes that it's working. This film was so fragmented and so... The scenes are very, very short. Often, you know, they're playing at two different levels. As I said, somehow, at rushes, I kind of thought, well, nobody's going to understand that till I see what goes... They see what I'm going to put either side of it. So it's tricky to know exactly whether you were getting it right at the time, to be honest.
You have a favourite scene, moment?
I do, yes. Yes, I do. There are... I suppose the part of the movie that I ended up being most thrilled with, because I hadn't expected it to be that way, is the whole performance of the play at the end. Not particularly because of what I've done, but because of the way the whole movie kind of gathers and collects and comes together and somehow becomes more than it is at that moment. The point where literally the audience in the cinema is watching itself reflected in an audience within the movie, and in between is this sort of ambiguous realm where this love story is playing out, which we are simultaneously watching on two levels: the level of the two characters we've been watching all the way through the movie, and the level of the literary, the fictional entities that we know they're becoming, and that we have in turn the vantage of posterity to appreciate. And at the same time, there's a documentary level of reality to that sequence that is startling to me. I never expected it to feel or look so real, but it does. You feel like you're watching that. You think that's what the first performance of Romeo and Juliet must have been like. And it's also the point where all the patterns in the film come together. You know, it's a very patterned script, and what the camera is doing is sort of echoing at various places, and it's very nice the way that gathers at that point to me.
This is not exactly that moment, but before we leave a conversation about the film itself, here's a clip. Shakespeare in Love received the single most number of nominations in this year's Oscars for a film, with all those accolades for directing and performing and screenplay. Here's a scene, Shakespeare in Love.
Come again. Oh, I'm fortune's fool. I will be punished for this.
Let me talk about you a little bit as a director. I mean, lots of experience directing for television, lots of experience directing for radio.
And for stage.
And for stage, yeah. Born where? I know born in England, but where?
Portsmouth.
In Portsmouth?
Yeah.
A sea town.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Significant in the war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What was the significance in the war?
Well, it has the largest port in England, and so
all the armed service people...
whole of the home fleet could effectively be anchored there at one time during the war. So we were bombed to smithereens. It's a city, I'm afraid, without much architectural distinction because of that, sort of like Berlin.
Yeah, it was just
flattened. Yeah, because they were always aiming for the harbour, and somehow they hit the town.
Yeah. You went to school where?
School in Bristol, Clifton College in Bristol, and then to Cambridge.
Yeah. And out of Cambridge, you wanted to go into the theatre right away?
Yes, I ran a theatre company after I left Cambridge, or actually while still there, called the Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company, which strangely brought undergraduate casts together with professional directors and toured America with Shakespeare productions. So, yeah, that was the beginning of a long association.
Thinking that you would be a kind of Richard Eyre or what?
At the time, to be honest with you, I ran the company. I was acting more than directing, and I assistant directed Jonathan Miller on all of those productions. We did about 4 over 4 years, and I hadn't yet discovered that my place was not on the stage, but in front of it, or at least that was the place I felt more comfortable.
Tell me about that idea, because that happens to lots of people.
Yes.
Who go from thinking they're going to be a performer to becoming an executive, or becoming something else behind the scene. What is it that takes place?
Well, in my case, I think because I was a good mimic when I was a kid, everybody thought I would be an actor, because I think, commonly people confuse mimicry with acting as if they're the same thing. I didn't have the right sensibility to be an actor, in the sense that I couldn't inhabit one person and shut out everything else. I have a much more kind of generalized, objective way of seeing the world, I think, and I was always aware that I was actually outside looking in when I was acting, which is an absolutely hopeless, completely debilitating problem if you're an actor.
Outside looking in rather than inside looking out.
Yeah, you have to, as an actor, you have to have this ability to shut out everything else, to see only from the perspective of the character that you're seeing, and let the other people impinge on you, and that's what dramatic interaction is about. I couldn't do that. I always was thinking about, well, I wouldn't do it quite like that. I'd do it like this, that kind of thing.
When you're casting something like this, I mean, what are you looking for? What are you looking for in the character that Gwyneth Paltrow plays?
Well, it's interesting thing, actually, because people imagine that you are looking for a particular thing and you're trying to bend the person who comes in to meet you into that thing, and it isn't really the case. I have a very strong idea about what the character should feel like, what qualities they need, whether there is an innocence that they must have, or a particular kind of quality. And the person who is right for the role, I generally find, is the person who transcends what you've already defined it to be, which the great actors do, who teach you something about the part that you hadn't really seen was there. And to me, directing is all about that. It's all about the limits of your control, the limits of what you can plan, what you can harness. And casting is the same thing. I believe that certain roles belong to certain actors. I'm absolutely convinced of this. You go through it. Well, there's a sort of fatalism you have to have when you're casting, because you may, for example, decide that so-and-so is the perfect person for the role, but they're not available, or so-and-so is the perfect person for the role, but they turn you down. I feel then that if I move on to the next person, that is right, it's appropriate in some way. And I feel, with everything I've done, actually, that I've ended up with the cast that is completely right for it, in my terms, and hopefully the rest of the world's. Joe and Gwyneth, for example, in this movie, absolutely were destined to play those two roles, in my view.
Why was Gwyneth destined to play that role?
Well, she's English to begin with admittedly a brilliant American accent, but no, I think she has just the perfect qualities for this part.
How much of that is visual?
A lot of it's visual. I mean, we've got to believe that this is a person who is capable of inspiring that play, and the prototype of all Shakespearean heroines that followed. And the movies, let's face it, are about that. It's an intense love story in which all the men have got to identify with him and be as attracted to her and so on and so forth. So that the physical presence and charisma is an incredibly important part of it. But you wouldn't be off the starting blocks if you didn't have the sort of skill that she has. I mean, she's got a very, very unusual talent, and I think a range that people are only just beginning to become aware of. But she particularly has both the sort of strange duality she can be, for example, the ingénue at the beginning of the story that she has to be, and the mature, empowered woman at the end. She has an incredible mixture of, you know, strength and power and vulnerability at the same time. All lead actors must have that. But she's also physically so real and such a sort of fantastic sensual presence, and yet there's something very idealized about her as well.
This is a terrific film that's getting a lot of attention and well-deserved at the Oscars and with movie audiences around the country, and I suspect. Is it overseas yet or not?
Yeah, it's open. It's been open for about a month in England. It's just opening everywhere in Europe now. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
John Madden, nominated for Best Director, Shakespeare in Love. We'll be right back. Stay with us.